Fire SHE slapped the Duke at her sister's wedding. 3 months later, she was his bride. In the grand hall of Castle Windmere, hundreds of nobles gathered, their laughter and whispers filling the air like a delicate, dangerous web. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting fractured light across the marble floor. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the faint, sharp tang of burning candles, creating a perfume both sweet and unsettling. Alara stood near the entrance, her hands gripping the folds of her gown. She was not the bride today. Her sister Lyria was, but that did not quell the storm rising inside her. She watched, tense and alert, as her sister's golden hair caught the candlelight. Lyria smiled at the guests, radiant and composed, oblivious to the whispers of envy and rivalry that floated like shadows in the hall. And then she saw him, the Duke of Ravenhurst. He was a man of imposing stature, his dark coat embroidered with silver thread that glimmered like starlight. His hair, black as midnight, fell loosely over his shoulders, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds, sharp and calculating. He did not smile. He rarely did. Rumors surrounded him, stories of ruthless negotiations, of enemies who vanished, of a man who commanded obedience with a mere glance. He moved with the calm certainty of someone who knew he was feared. Alara's jaw tightened. There was something in the way he looked at Lyria, the faint curl of his lips as if he were amused by her happiness. And then came the words, barely audible, spoken in that smooth, dangerous tone that seemed to slide into her chest and squeeze. "Your sister is charming, though she lacks a certain spark." Alara's heart skipped. The insult was subtle, the kind that hid poison beneath civility. Fury rose in her chest like a storm. She had always defended her family, and she could not, would not, let this man belittle her sister in front of the court. The Duke's eyes met hers for the first time, sharp as blades, and Alara felt a chill. But she did not flinch. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady though trembling beneath with anger. The Duke turned toward her, his expression one of mild curiosity, as if she were a puzzle he had not yet solved. "I merely spoke truth," he said, his tone calm, almost bored. Alara's temper, always quick to ignite, could not tolerate his arrogance. Without thinking, she stepped forward and struck him, her hand connecting firmly with his cheek. The room froze. The crystal chandeliers seemed to shiver, and the music faltered as gasps rippled across the hall. For a moment the Duke said nothing. Then slowly he raised a hand to touch his cheek, his eyes narrowing as they locked on hers. There was no anger, no immediate retaliation. Only a cold, measured appraisal, as if he were assessing whether she was worth noticing or worth punishing. "You will regret that," he said finally, his voice low, smooth, and dangerous. "Mark my words." Alara's pulse raced, a mixture of fear and exhilaration surging through her veins. She had never faced a man like him, a man who commanded respect without raising his voice. Yet she refused to show weakness. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Some admired her courage, some questioned her sanity. Lyria's radiant smile faltered slightly when she saw the tension in her sister's face, but she said nothing. The Duke, for his part, did not speak to her again that night. He merely watched, a silent predator observing prey, calculating every gesture, every breath. By the time the last candle burned low, the guests had departed, leaving the castle quiet except for the soft crackle of the hearth. Alara wandered the hall alone, her thoughts tangled like the shadows dancing on the walls. She knew she had challenged someone dangerous, someone powerful. The slap had been impulsive, reckless, but it had been a necessary act. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she could not shake the feeling that her life had just changed forever. 3 months passed in a haze of ordinary days, but the memory of the Duke lingered like smoke. Alara tried to avoid thinking about him, focusing on her studies, her duties, and her walks in the castle gardens. But rumors had a way of finding her, whispers carried on the wind and in letters delivered by couriers. It was a cold morning when the letter arrived. The seal bore the Ravenhurst crest, a black raven in flight. Alara's hands shook as she broke it open. The words within were simple, yet they struck her like a thunderclap. Lady Alara Windmere, you are requested at Ravenhurst Castle. Your presence is required immediately. The Duke awaits. Her heart pounded. Why? Why summon her after all this time? The letter bore no explanation, no reason, only the imperious mark of the Duke. Alara knew deep down that this was no ordinary summons. By nightfall, she found herself traveling through snow-dusted forests, the moon casting silver light over frost-covered branches. Ravens cawed in the distance, their cries carrying a sense of foreboding. The journey was long and silent, broken only by the crunch of her boots on frozen earth. Each mile brought her closer to the Duke and further from the life she had known. Ravenhurst Castle loomed like a shadow in the night, its spires piercing the sky. The gates opened with a slow groan and Alara stepped inside, her breath visible in the cold, torchlit courtyard. She felt a tremor of fear and anticipation. The Duke awaited her in the great hall, as imposing as the rumors had promised. His dark eyes met hers, unreadable as he rose from his seat. "Lady Alara," he said, his voice as smooth and dangerous as ever, "welcome to Ravenhurst." Alara's hands curled into fists at her sides, yet she forced herself to stand tall. "You summoned me. Why?" He took a step closer, and she noticed the faintest shift in his expression, a flicker of something that was not arrogance, not disdain, curiosity perhaps, or amusement. "You remember the night of your sister's wedding?" he asked, his tone even, almost conversational. "The night you struck me?" Alara's heart raced. She did. She remembered every detail, the gasp of the crowd, the flush of her own fury, the cold weight of his stare. "I remember," she said, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. He nodded once as if confirming a thought in his own mind. Then he said the words that made her world tilt on its axis. "You will be my bride." Alara's breath caught. The fire of anger rose again, hotter than before. "You what?" "It is not a request," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. "3 months ago you challenged me, you struck me, and I do not forgive challenges lightly. You will come to Ravenhurst as my wife." Alara felt the walls of the hall close around her. Her life, once free and full of choice, now seemed to hang on the edge of a blade. The Duke's declaration was not just a claim, it was a challenge, a storm she could not walk away from. Her mind raced. Could she refuse? What power did she have against a man like him, a man whose name alone bent people to fear and obedience? Yet a stubborn, reckless part of her, the part that had struck him months ago, refused to bow. "I will never be your bride," she said, her voice firm, trembling only slightly. The Duke's lips curved, faintly, almost imperceptibly. "We shall see," he said. And then, without another word, he turned and left, leaving her alone in the grand hall, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows across the marble floor. Alara sank onto a nearby bench, her mind a whirlwind of fear, fury, and reluctant fascination. She did not yet understand what she was facing, but she knew one thing. Her life was about to be consumed by a fire she could neither ignore nor escape. Outside, the wind howled through the towers of Ravenhurst Castle, carrying with it a whisper of something ancient and dark. A shadow moved along the battlements, watching, waiting, as if the castle itself had recognized her arrival. And in that moment, Alara realized that the slap she had dealt months ago had set in motion a chain of events she could not possibly control. Somewhere deep within, she felt a strange thrill, a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was no ordinary marriage, no ordinary life. It was a collision of wills, a storm of power and pride, and she was at its center. The Duke had claimed her. And the question that burned hotter than the fire in the hearth was not whether she could resist him. It was whether she would survive the world he ruled, the power he wielded, and the secrets he carried in the shadows of Ravenhurst. As the moon rose high over the castle, casting silver light through the stained-glass windows, Alara stood, her resolve hardening. She would face the Duke. She would face whatever this world demanded of her, and she would not bow, not yet. But somewhere deep in the heart of Ravenhurst Castle, the Duke's gaze lingered, and a quiet, dangerous thought took root. She challenges me, and I have never been challenged like this before. The hall was silent again, except for the distant cawing of a raven and the whisper of the wind. But the storm had already begun. Alara stepped through the gates of Ravenhurst Castle, the heavy iron doors closing behind her with a resounding thud that echoed through the vast courtyard. The castle was larger than she had imagined, its dark stone walls rising like mountains into the foggy sky. Towering spires and jagged battlements were silhouetted against the moonlight, giving the place an ominous, almost living presence. She felt as though the shadows themselves watched her every move. The snow crunched beneath her boots, cold and unyielding, as if the very ground wanted to test her resolve. Inside, the warmth of the hearths met her, but it did little to calm the fluttering in her chest. She was here in the heart of the Duke's world, alone and unarmed against a man whose power was whispered in fear throughout the kingdoms. Callan, the Duke of Ravenhurst, waited for her in the great hall. He stood at the far end, tall and imposing, his coat dark as midnight, shoulders squared and eyes like storm clouds. The room itself seemed to bend to his presence. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows across the high, vaulted ceiling. Despite the grandeur, the hall was cold, almost empty, echoing every step she took. "You have arrived," Callan said, his voice smooth, calm, yet carrying the weight of command. "Do you understand why you are here?" Alara squared her shoulders, lifting her chin. "You told me," she said firmly. "You said I would be your bride, but I do not understand why." Callan's eyes flicked to hers, sharp and calculating. "Why? Perhaps because you challenged me. Perhaps because you struck me in front of the court and refused to submit. Perhaps because I see something in you that no one else does." Alara's pulse quickened. His words were both unnerving and magnetic. She could not tell if he was testing her or simply speaking the truth. "Something in me?" she repeated, skepticism and curiosity warring in her tone. He stepped closer and she felt the weight of his presence pressing against her senses. "A fire, a spirit that refuses to be tamed. That is dangerous and rare." Alara looked away, her heart hammering. She hated that he was right. There had always been a fire in her, fierce and untamed, and it had led her into trouble countless times. But it had also kept her alive, kept her strong. Callan studied her silently for a moment, then gestured toward the hallway. "Come. You will need to learn the rules of Ravenhurst if you are to remain here and survive." The corridors of Ravenhurst Castle were long and labyrinthine, lined with portraits of past dukes and duchesses, whose eyes seemed to follow her every step. Tapestries depicting battles, hunts, and ancient ceremonies hung like frozen memories, their colors faded but their presence undeniable. Every corner she turned, every doorway she passed, whispered stories of power and dominance. Callan led her to her chamber, a room both lavish and imposing. The walls were lined with books, and a large fireplace glowed faintly, though the cold seeped through the stones. A tall, carved bed sat in the center, draped with heavy velvet curtains. Though beautiful, the room carried the same feeling as the rest of the castle, a sense of order, control, and a quiet warning. "You will stay here," Callan said. "Your movements will be observed, your habits noted. You are part of Ravenhurst now, whether you wish it or not." Alara bristled at the words, but she did not argue. She had learned long ago that some battles were better fought in silence, biding one's time until the moment was right. "I will not submit," she said, her voice steady. Callan's lips curved in a faint, unreadable smile. "We shall see." Days passed, each one a mixture of cold formality and subtle power struggles. Alara was constantly aware of Callan's gaze, the way he watched her from a distance, always measuring, always calculating. Every conversation was a duel, every glance a test. She spoke boldly, refusing to yield, and he countered with calm authority, never raising his voice but bending every situation to his control. And yet, there were moments when his mask slipped. One evening, a candlelight flickered in the library, casting shadows across the rows of books. Alara was reading quietly when Kalen appeared, moving silently behind her. She felt his presence before she saw him, a cold awareness that made her skin prickle. "You read," he said softly, startling her. "I read to pass the time," she replied, closing the book, unwilling to show any vulnerability. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, studying her. "You are unlike the others who come here. They cower, they obey, they fear. You do not." Alara's lips pressed into a thin line. "I will not live in fear of anyone." Kalen's expression softened slightly, not entirely, but enough to make her question what she had assumed about him. There was a shadow behind his eyes, something darker than the cold exterior he showed the world. A sadness, perhaps, or a burden he carried alone. "Good," he said finally. "You should not." Then, without another word, he left, leaving her with more questions than answers. The castle was not without danger, even beyond the Duke himself. Rumors whispered of rival nobles, jealous of Ravenhurst's power, who would do anything to harm him, or those he claimed. One night, while walking through the snow-covered gardens, Alara felt the first taste of that danger. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of frost and something darker, something watching. A shadow moved behind the hedges, silent and predatory. Alara's heart raced. She spun around, ready to confront whatever it was, only to find Kalen stepping from the darkness, his presence sudden and commanding. "You should not wander alone," he said, his voice low. "The world is not kind to those who are unprepared." Alara swallowed, feeling both relief and frustration. "I can take care of myself," she said. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faintest lines of worry on his face. "Perhaps," he said, "but not tonight. Tonight you are mine to protect, and I do not fail." The words were not a threat, yet they carried weight, a promise, a warning, and a challenge all at once. Weeks passed, and Alara began to learn the rhythm of life in Ravenhurst. She discovered the hidden stairways, the quiet passages, and the secret gardens where the snow never melted. She saw glimpses of the Duke's life, the letters he wrote in secrecy, the guards who moved at his command, and the strange, whispered magic that seemed to hum through the very stones of the castle. Kalen, for his part, tested her constantly. He assigned tasks, set challenges, and watched her responses carefully. Every time she defied him, he responded with quiet authority, never anger, never cruelty, but always reminding her of the power he held. And yet, beneath that rigid exterior, there were glimpses of a man who had been shaped by loss, by duty, by something older and darker than mere ambition. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and purple, Kalen called her to the highest tower of the castle. The wind roared around them, and the clouds swirled like shadows. "You must understand," he said, his eyes stormy, "that being part of Ravenhurst is not a gift. It is a responsibility, a burden, and it is not without danger." Alara met his gaze, feeling the weight of his words. "I understand," she said, though her heart beat faster with uncertainty. Kalen's expression softened slightly, almost imperceptibly. "You are brave," he said, his voice low. "Bravery alone will not be enough. You must be clever, careful, and loyal, but more than that, you must trust me when the time comes." Alara's chest tightened. Trust him. The words were simple, yet heavy with meaning. Could she trust a man who had declared her bride against her will? Could she trust someone whose power was absolute, whose reputation inspired both awe and fear? Before she could answer, a sudden noise from the battlements caught their attention. A shadow moved against the moonlight, swift and silent, a presence that was not meant to be. Kalen's eyes narrowed, and he moved to intercept it. "Alara," he said, his voice firm, Stay behind me." Her heart pounded, and for the first time she felt the full weight of what it meant to be at Ravenhurst, to be bound, willingly or not, to a man whose world was as dangerous as it was dark. As Kaelin disappeared into the shadowed corridors, Alara realized that her life had changed irrevocably. She was no longer merely a visitor. She was a part of this castle, this world, and this man, and the trials ahead would test every ounce of her courage. The wind howled through the towers, carrying with it the sense of unseen eyes, waiting, watching. Ravenhurst was alive in a way she had never imagined, and she was at the very heart of it. Winter had settled over Ravenhurst Castle like a silver cloak. Snow drifted lazily over the high towers, covering the spires and battlements in white, while frost crept along the stone walls. Inside, the castle was alive with quiet movement, footsteps echoing in the halls, whispers of servants, and the ever-present shadow of its master, Kaelin, the Duke of Ravenhurst. Alara moved through the corridors, her boots silent against the cold stone floors. She had learned the layout of the castle well enough now to navigate it without guidance. Yet, despite her familiarity, she never lost the feeling that the castle itself watched her, breathing in shadows and secrets. Every room, every corner seemed to hold a memory, a story of power, triumph, or betrayal. Kaelin had been more present in her life over the past few weeks, not through kindness but through control. Every task she undertook was observed, every word she spoke weighed. Their verbal sparring continued, sharp and thrilling, but it had taken on a new intensity. She felt a connection to him she could not explain, a mix of fear, fascination, and something deeper stirring in her chest. One evening, the storm outside was relentless. Snow slammed against the tall windows, and the wind tore through the towers as if trying to enter every hall. The castle groaned beneath the cold, and Alara found herself in the library, seeking the comfort of books. It was a large room, walls lined with ancient tomes and scrolls, the faint smell of parchment and dust mingling with the smoke from the fireplace. She was reading quietly when the door opened, and Kaelin stepped in, dripping from the snow that had clung to his cloak. He did not speak at once. He simply watched her, his presence filling the room dark and overwhelming. "You are persistent," he said finally, his voice low and commanding, yet carrying an edge she could not define. Alara looked up, meeting his storm-colored eyes. "I am not here to cower," she replied firmly. "I survive as I always have." Kaelin's lips curved faintly. "You are unlike any I have encountered. Most would bend, break, or flee. You," he paused, studying her, "you are fire." Alara's chest tightened. The words unsettled her in a way she could not name. She wanted to resist, to remind him that she did not belong here willingly, that she was his bride only by his decree. Yet beneath her defiance there was an undeniable thrill, a spark that she could not ignore. Before she could respond, the wind outside tore at the windows, and the candle flames flickered violently. Shadows danced across the walls, elongating and twisting into strange, fleeting forms. The castle felt alive, and for a moment, Alara's thoughts strayed to the stories whispered in the halls, the rumors of curses and magic bound to Ravenhurst, of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. Kaelin noticed the shift in her gaze. "The castle does not merely stand," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "It watches, it waits, and sometimes it warns." Alara swallowed. "Warns of what?" "Of danger, and of what is buried in the past," he replied. His eyes softened, the first glimpse of something almost human behind the storm of his reputation. "There are forces here older than either of us, forces that demand respect and caution." The tension in the room was electric, unspoken yet undeniable. Alara could feel it in her pulse, in the quickening of her breath. She realized that Kaelin was not merely a man of power. He was a man shaped by danger, by duty, and by something dark that few understood. Days turned into nights, and the storm raged outside without relent. Alara found herself learning more about the Duke, piece by piece. He was harsh, demanding, and calculating, yet moments of vulnerability surfaced, brief and fleeting. A frown when a letter brought news of a rival noble's plotting, a subtle sigh when he thought she wasn't looking, a quiet intensity in his gaze when she acted boldly or cleverly. One night she wandered the halls alone, restless and uneasy. The storm had quieted, leaving only the moonlight to guide her path. The castle, usually familiar, felt different, darker, more alive. She followed the sound of faint music, soft and haunting, leading her to the ballroom. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air. Kalen was there, standing alone in the center of the room, watching the moonlight play across the floor. He turned as she entered, his eyes holding hers with that same intensity that had become impossible to ignore. "You should not wander alone," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I needed to think," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart thudded rapidly. "I cannot sleep when I am in this place, this castle that watches." Kalen stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking with each measured step. "Ravenhurst watches," he said, "but it is not unkind. It will test you, yes, but it also shows what must be seen. You must be ready for what is coming." Alara swallowed hard. "And what is coming?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, the shadows from the tall windows playing across his features. There was a storm in his eyes, not just of anger or control, but of something deeper, loss, guilt, and a quiet longing that startled her. Finally, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "You are part of this now, whether you accept it or not, and soon you will need to choose. Not between obedience or defiance, but between fear and trust." The words hung between them, heavy and electric. Alara felt a shiver run down her spine. Trust. It was a word she had never used lightly, a word she had rarely extended to anyone. And yet here it was, dangling before her, offered by the man who had claimed her against her will, yet who now seemed human, vulnerable in ways she could not have imagined. Before she could respond, the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the castle. Kalen's expression hardened. He moved toward the balcony, motioning for her to follow. From the moonlit balcony she saw them, figures moving through the snow-covered courtyard, silent and deliberate. Rivals, intruders, shadows in the night, approaching with intent unknown. "Alara," Kalen said, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "Stay behind me." Her pulse raced. Fear, adrenaline, and something else. A strange, thrilling sense of anticipation coursed through her veins. She had survived many dangers in her life, yet standing beside the Duke, facing the unknown, felt like standing at the edge of a storm. The intruders came closer, their forms emerging from the shadows. Kalen's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, his stance poised and commanding. The Duke of Ravenhurst was a force of nature, and yet he moved with precision, guarding not only himself but her as well. Alara realized in that moment the depth of her connection to him. The anger and defiance she had felt months ago had transformed into something more complex. She admired his strength, feared his power, and yet felt an undeniable pull toward him, a connection that went beyond fear or duty. The intruders halted, sensing resistance. Kalen's voice cut through the night, calm and commanding. "Leave, you are not welcome." For a moment the silence was absolute. Then one of the figures stepped forward, a dagger glinting in the moonlight. Kalen's eyes narrowed. With swift precision he disarmed the intruder, the motion so fast it was almost invisible. The others retreated, melting into the shadows. Alara exhaled, her heart pounding. "That was," she began, but words failed her. Kalen sheathed his sword, his eyes meeting hers. There was no boast, no triumph, only a quiet acknowledgement of the danger they had faced. "Ravenhurst is not a place for the faint of heart," he said softly, "and neither am I." Her gaze met his, and for the first time the fire of defiance within her mingled with something else, something raw and undeniable. Respect, curiosity, a spark of desire she could not yet name. The storm passed, leaving a pale winter dawn in its wake. The snow glistened in the morning light, and the castle seemed momentarily peaceful, though the memory of the night lingered. Ilara walked through the halls, thoughts tangled. Kalen was more than a man of power. He was a man of shadows and secrets, and the more she saw of him, the more she understood the depth of his world and the danger it held. Yet beneath that danger was something else. Moments of vulnerability, fleeting smiles, and quiet glances had revealed a man capable of trust, of loyalty, and perhaps of love. Ilara knew one thing for certain: she could not remain untouched by him. The fire that had sparked the slap at the wedding had grown into a storm, one that threatened to consume them both. And in the heart of Ravenhurst Castle, surrounded by shadows, secrets, and whispers of ancient power, the first true bond between them began to form, a bond of fire, fear, and an undeniable growing connection that neither could ignore. The first light of dawn stretched across Ravenhurst Castle, painting the snow-dusted towers in pale gold and silver. Inside, the castle was quiet, almost expectant, as if it too held its breath for what was to come. Ilara stood at the window of her chamber, watching the frost glimmer on the spires and battlements. Her heart was heavy, a mixture of anticipation, fear, and something deeper she could not yet name. The night had changed everything. The shadowed intruders, the whispered warnings, and Kalen's calm yet powerful protection had revealed a truth she could not ignore. She was bound to this place, and to him, in ways that went beyond duty or fear. When she turned, Kalen was there, standing in the doorway, his presence filling the room as always. His eyes, storm-colored and unreadable, softened for the first time in weeks. "The castle is waking," he said quietly, "and so must we. There is more at stake than you realize." Ilara's gaze met his. "I have begun to understand a little, but I still do not know all of it. Why is Ravenhurst so alive?" Kalen stepped closer, his movements deliberate and calm. "The castle carries the weight of our family, its history, its power, and its curse. For generations, the Dukes of Ravenhurst have been bound to this place. It watches, judges, and sometimes punishes, and it tests those who enter, those who remain, and those it chooses to protect." Ilara swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. "And the curse?" He exhaled, a faint tension in his shoulders betraying the stoicism he always displayed. "The curse is older than you or I. It is not a simple spell. It binds the Duke to the castle and, in turn, anyone who stands by him. Only trust, courage, and loyalty can break it, or at least soften its hold." Her chest tightened. She realized then that the stakes were higher than she had imagined. Her presence here was not merely a political or social arrangement. She had become part of something ancient, something dangerous, and yet something that could not exist without her. The day passed with an air of quiet preparation. Servants moved silently through the halls, arranging chambers and lighting torches. Kalen spent his hours in the library and chambers of the castle, reading old tomes and consulting maps, while Ilara practiced walking the halls with purpose, learning the paths, observing, and understanding the rhythms of Ravenhurst. It was in the late afternoon, in the quiet of the main hall, that Kalen finally spoke to her directly, away from the formalities and the observation of servants. "You have grown stronger in these weeks," he said, his tone almost approving. "You face the castle, its shadows, and even me with a courage most cannot summon." Ilara met his gaze, her pulse quickening. "I have no choice," she admitted. "If I am to survive here, I must learn, I must face it all, and I must face you." Kalen's eyes softened just slightly, as if he recognized the truth of her words. "Good," he said, "because soon we will face more than shadows or intruders. The true challenge is coming, the test of the heart and the power of trust." That evening, a strange wind swept through the castle, carrying with it whispers that seemed to speak directly to Ilara. The torches flickered violently, and shadows moved in ways that were not quite natural. She followed the sound, drawn by an instinct she could not name, to the tower chamber, the oldest room in the castle, where the walls were lined with carvings and ancient symbols. Kalen was already there, waiting. The firelight glowed between them, illuminating the sharp lines of his face, and the storm within his eyes seemed quieter, calmer, as if he had prepared for what was to come. "You are ready," he said simply. "Are you ready to see the truth of Ravenhurst?" Alara nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "I am ready," she whispered. He extended a hand, not commanding, not ordering, but offering. "Then take it. Together we will face what lies within." She hesitated only for a moment, then placed her hand in his. The warmth of his grip, steady and strong, coursed through her like a current, and she realized that this was not just about power or survival. This was about connection, about trust, about two people standing together against the weight of the past. The chamber shifted as they moved. Shadows twisted and rose, whispering secrets and fears. The air seemed thick with ancient magic, pressing against their bodies, their minds, their very hearts. Alara felt fear, yes, but also courage, because Kalen was beside her, his presence unwavering, his hand a tether to reality and strength. "The curse," Kalen said, his voice low, "feeds on fear, doubt, and solitude. If we face it together, it will weaken. If we falter, it will consume us." Alara drew in a breath. She thought of all the moments that had led to this point. The slap, the challenges, the arguments, the storms, the long nights filled with tension and unspoken words. Every step, every choice, every act of defiance had prepared her for this moment. She nodded. "Then we face it together." The shadows around them coalesced, forming shapes that whispered and swirled, echoes of the past, of wrongs committed, of lives lost, of power misused. Alara and Kalen stood side by side, their hands clasped, their hearts beating in unison. Kalen stepped forward first, and the shadows recoiled as if recognizing his authority. "We are not afraid," he said firmly. "We do not falter. Together, we are stronger than your power." Alara repeated the words, her voice steady. "We are not afraid. We do not falter. Together, we are stronger." The shadows hissed, twisted, and lunged, but each movement they made was met with unwavering courage. Step by step, Alara and Kalen advanced, their trust and unity forming a shield stronger than any spell or steel. And then, in a blinding flash of silver light, the shadows dissolved, leaving only the warm glow of the fire and the soft hum of the castle itself. Ravenhurst was quiet once more, alive, but no longer threatening. The curse had not been broken entirely, but it had been softened, its power diminished by their courage and connection. Exhausted but victorious, Alara sank to the floor, leaning against the warmth of Kalen's side. He lowered himself beside her, close enough that she could feel the strength of his body and the steady rhythm of his heart. "You did well," he said softly, the storm in his eyes finally giving way to something gentler. "We did well." Alara's lips curved into a small smile. "We did," she whispered, realizing the truth of it. Alone, neither of them could have faced what had just occurred. Together they had prevailed. For the first time, the walls between them seemed to crumble. The anger, the defiance, the fear, they were replaced by something new. Something neither of them had dared to name, but both could feel. A bond forged in fire and shadows, in courage and trust, in the unspoken promise that they would face whatever came next together. Kalen reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Alara," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, "you challenged me, defied me, and yet you stood by my side when it mattered most. You are no ordinary woman. You are my equal, and if you will allow it, my partner in every sense of the word." Alara's breath caught. The fire that had always burned within her now glimmered with a new warmth, acceptance, understanding, and something deeper. She placed her hand over his. "I will stand by your side," she said, "not because I must, but because I choose to." A quiet smile spread across Kalen's face, rare and genuine. "Then you are free," he said softly. "Free to be who you are and to choose this life with me, not because of duty, but because it is ours." Outside, the first rays of sunlight touched the towers of Ravenhurst Castle, turning the snow into a glimmering sea of gold and silver. The castle, once a place of shadows and fear, now seemed alive with warmth and promise. Ilara and Kaelin rose together, walking hand in hand through the corridors. The castle seemed to recognize their bond, the walls no longer cold or forbidding, but welcoming, protective, alive in a new way. They stopped at the great hall, once the site of her defiance, now a symbol of their union and transformation. Kaelin turned to her, eyes soft and steady. "You have changed this place, and perhaps it has changed you as well." Ilara smiled, feeling the weight of the past months lift. "And you have changed me," she said, "not by command or power, but by trust, and by showing me that even the darkest places can hold light." Kaelin's hand tightened around hers, a silent promise. "Then let this be the beginning," he said, "of a life forged together in fire, in shadow, and in courage." For the first time in months, Ilara felt a calm certainty. The storm of their first encounter, the slap, the anger, the defiance, had transformed into something enduring, a bond that neither power nor shadow could undo. As they walked through the halls of Ravenhurst, the castle itself seemed to hum with life, a gentle acknowledgment of the courage and trust that now bound them together. Outside, the snow glistened, and the first birds of spring could be heard singing in the distance, a quiet reminder that even in the coldest winters, warmth and renewal could bloom. Ilara looked up at Kaelin, seeing not just the Duke, not just the man of power, but someone who had learned to trust and care, who had let himself be vulnerable in her presence. And she knew in her heart that she had found not only safety and partnership, but love, quiet, powerful, and enduring. The fire of the past had burned bright, and now it glowed steady, warm, and unbreakable, binding two hearts in the shadows and light of Ravenhurst Castle.